Park Bones thought the worst was behind him. 2 years after Sophia Parks destroyed their marriage with betrayal and lies, he'd rebuilt his life in Austin, learned to sleep through the night, stopped checking his phone for apologies that would never come. Then her lawyer sent him one document that made him burst out laughing in his empty apartment. Inside was proof that Sophia had committed federal crimes to hide nearly $500,000 during their divorce, evidence so damning that her own attorney had flipped sides to destroy her. Swiss bank accounts. Offshore transfers. A half-sister working as her secret accomplice. And Park, the man she'd left broken, was about to get it all back while she faced prison time. What happened next will restore your faith that sometimes, just sometimes, the truth catches up with liars. Viewers, have you ever watched someone who hurt you finally face consequences? How did it feel? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. Park Bones stood in the doorway of his Austin apartment, a cream-colored envelope trembling in his weathered hands. At 38, he'd spent 2 years rebuilding himself after the collapse of his marriage to Sophia Parks, 2 years learning to sleep through nights that once stretched endlessly, 2 years convincing himself the worst was behind him. The morning sun cut through his window, illuminating the wedding ring still circling his finger like a ghost he couldn't quite banish. His coffee grew cold as he stared at the embossed logo in the corner, Whitmore and Associates Legal Group, Houston, Texas. Sophia's lawyer. His stomach twisted violently. They'd been divorced for 18 months, the settlement finalized, no children binding them to endless negotiations, no property disputes lingering like open wounds. What could they possibly want now? He tore the envelope open right there, hands shaking not from fear but from something darker, something that tasted like unfinished business. Inside lay a single document, maybe 4 pages thick, dense with legal terminology and official stamps. But the handwritten note paperclip to the first page made his blood freeze mid-flow. Mr. Bones, you'll want to read this carefully. Some truths take longer to surface than others. Janet Whitmore, Esq. Park paced his living room, the Austin skyline blurring through the window behind him as his eyes scanned the document for the 3rd time. The title made his chest tighten, Affidavit of Financial Disclosure and Marital Asset Fraud. This wasn't Sophia's lawyer representing her against him. This was Sophia's lawyer representing him, exposing what had been systematically stolen during their marriage. According to the affidavit, Sophia had hidden a joint investment account containing $340,000, purchased real estate under shell company names he'd never heard of, and maintained a safety deposit box in San Antonio filled with jewelry and bearer bonds. She'd used her pharmaceutical sales position to funnel bonuses and stock options into secret accounts, carefully timing every transaction to occur before filing for divorce. 9 years ago, they'd met at a charity gala in Dallas, her laugh lighting up the entire ballroom, him a young project manager desperate to prove himself worthy of her attention. They'd married fast, his mother warning him about rushing, but he'd believed in their love with the kind of faith that destroys men. By year 5, she worked late constantly, took weekend trips for conferences that never quite added up, became a stranger sleeping beside him. He'd convinced himself he was paranoid until that afternoon he came home early, found her car in the driveway when it shouldn't have been, found her upstairs with someone he trusted. Park's thumb hovered over Janet Whitmore's number on his phone screen, his jaw set as he pressed dial. The attorney's voice came through crisp and professional, laced with satisfaction that made him uneasy. She explained that Sophia hadn't just hidden assets from him but from the court, from her own legal representation, from the federal government itself. Janet had represented Sophia during their divorce, billing $90,000 in legal fees that were never paid in full. When she'd tried to collect, she discovered Sophia had transferred assets offshore, claiming poverty while living in a luxury condo in Houston's Museum District. That's when Janet Whitmore, a woman known in legal circles for her ruthlessness, had started digging with the kind of personal vendetta that terrified opposing counsel. What she'd found was explosive enough to make her switch sides entirely, now offering to help Park recover what was rightfully his in exchange for 30% of recovered assets. The document she'd compiled contained bank statements, property deeds, photographs of documents Sophia had signed with flourishes that seemed to mock him across time. 3 weeks before filing for divorce, Sophia had traveled to the Cayman Islands under the guise of a company retreat, opening accounts at 2 separate institutions and depositing cashier's checks totaling $280,000. Park sat across from Janet Whitmore in a sleek glass conference room in Houston, morning light cutting harsh shadows across papers spread like puzzle pieces on the mahogany table. Janet laid out their strategy with military precision, explaining they had evidence but needed more, gaps in the financial trail that suggested accounts opened under aliases or through untraceable cryptocurrency exchanges. She'd hired Raymond Cole, a former FBI financial crimes investigator turned forensic accountant, who'd already traced most of the money through a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore holdings. Janet slid a photograph across the table showing Sophia at a Houston restaurant, wine glass raised, laughing beside a tall man with an expensive watch and the kind of tan that came from yachts and privilege. His name was Cameron Hale, a venture capitalist divorced twice, currently under investigation for securities fraud, and apparently Sophia's new partner in both romance and criminal enterprise. They'd met approximately 8 months before Park's divorce was finalized, possibly longer, building a new life while systematically dismantling his old one. Cameron had connections that made him dangerous, offshore accounts, international business fronts, and a history of teaching women how to hide assets from their husbands. His first wife had walked away with almost nothing, discovering too late that millions were hidden in Panama and the British Virgin Islands. Park walked through a parking garage to his truck, stopping mid-stride to glance over his shoulder at shadows that stretched too long, the sensation of being watched crawling up his spine like ice. Janet's plan was elegant in its brutal simplicity. They'd file a motion to reopen the divorce case, citing new evidence of undisclosed assets, and the moment Sophia received the legal notice, she'd panic. She'd contact Cameron, try to move money, hide evidence, create false paper trails, and when she did, Raymond's monitoring software would catch every digital footprint. It was legal, barely, thanks to subpoenas Janet had secured through a sympathetic judge who'd presided over too many cases of marital fraud and had grown tired of watching criminals walk free. Park wanted to believe Sophia would make mistakes, that arrogance would become her downfall, but she'd fooled him for years, been 3 steps ahead through their entire marriage, made him question his own sanity when he'd suspected her betrayals. What he hadn't told Janet was that part of him wanted Sophia to escape, not from forgiveness but from exhaustion, because reopening this wound meant bleeding in front of strangers, admitting he'd been blind and stupid and pathetically trusting. But then he remembered her face during divorce proceedings, smug and pitying, as if he were a child finally learning the world was cruel. The process server handed the envelope to Sophia's doorman on a Tuesday morning while Janet's paralegal filed documents at the courthouse, the two events synchronized like a carefully choreographed attack. Within 6 hours, Raymond called Park with breathless excitement, explaining that Sophia had moved with desperate speed the moment she'd received the motion. She'd contacted Cameron for a 40-minute encrypted phone conversation, then made 3 international wire transfers totaling $85,000 to accounts in Switzerland and Singapore, the digital trail lighting up Raymond's monitoring systems like Christmas. But the truly interesting development was her contact with someone named Lillian Cross, a woman Park had never heard of despite 9 years of marriage to Sophia. Lillian was Sophia's half-sister, estranged from the family for over 15 years, currently working as a real estate broker in Portland, Oregon, and she'd just purchased a commercial building in Scottsdale, Arizona, in Sophia's name 3 weeks prior. The property had cost $1.2 million, paid entirely in cash that had materialized from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Sophia had never mentioned Lillian once, not during late-night conversations about family, not during holidays when Park asked why her father seemed distant, not during the funeral when her mother passed and Park stood beside her holding her hand through grief he believed was genuine. Park sat in a corner booth at a hotel bar in downtown Houston, dim lighting and soft jazz creating an atmosphere of forced intimacy as Sophia walked through the door wearing a designer dress and heels that clicked against marble like a countdown. He'd tracked her to a business conference at the Four Seasons through Raymond's intelligence, something in him snapping with the need to see her face, to know if guilt had found her in the 2 years since their divorce, to understand if she felt anything beyond the cold calculation that had defined their final years together. She slid into the booth across from him, her perfume the same as he remembered, voice neutral as she acknowledged his presence with practiced indifference. He mentioned the motion, watched her confidence falter for just a heartbeat before she recovered with a thin smile, asking if he really thought he could prove any of Janet's accusations. When he mentioned the Swiss accounts, Singapore, Lillian's name spoken like a weapon, Sophia went pale with the kind of genuine fear he hadn't seen since the day she'd been caught upstairs with his former friend. She stood abruptly, declaring the conversation over, but Park smiled as he watched her walk away through the window to where Cameron waited in a car, her phone already pressed to her ear before the door closed, the trap springing shut with mechanical precision. Federal agents entered a Houston bank on a Thursday morning while simultaneously raiding Cameron Hale's office downtown, documents being seized in coordinated strikes that suggested months of investigation preceding Park's motion. Sophia's panicked movements after their confrontation had triggered alerts across multiple agencies, the IRS having already watched Cameron for insider trading and tax evasion, her sudden wire transfers connecting their criminal partnership in ways that made prosecutors salivate. Within 1 week, federal charges were filed: tax evasion, wire fraud, conspiracy to conceal assets, and securities violations that carried prison sentences measured in years rather than months. Lillian Cross was the product of Sophia's father's affair, raised separately, acknowledged but never fully accepted into the family that had given Sophia everything while Lillian scraped by in subsidized housing with her mother. When Sophia had approached her 2 years ago with a business opportunity framed as reparations for childhood inequities, Lillian had seen it as justice, becoming the invisible accomplice who handled transactions that needed to stay off Sophia's radar. Janet called Park with triumph edging her voice, explaining that Sophia was being offered a deal: surrender all hidden assets, cooperate against Cameron, avoid prison. The court had frozen her accounts, issued orders for full restitution, and Park was looking at close to $500,000 in recovered funds, possibly more depending on penalties and interest calculated from the date of original concealment. Park sat at his kitchen table on a Thursday evening, a new envelope in front of him bearing court stamps and notary seals that made it feel heavy with finality. The settlement document ruled in his favor on every count, ordering Sophia to surrender all hidden assets, pay $487,000 in restitution within 90 days, and cover legal fees that would bankrupt her carefully constructed empire of lies. Federal investigators had discovered emails showing Cameron had been planning to betray Sophia all along, siphoning money from their joint offshore accounts into private holdings she didn't know existed, using her pharmaceutical connections to secure insider information on drug approvals and trading on that information through shell companies. When confronted, Cameron had flipped immediately, offering testimony against Sophia in exchange for leniency, the man she'd trusted proving himself to be exactly what she'd been to Park: a user, a manipulator, someone incapable of loyalty beyond self-preservation. The last page contained a handwritten note from Janet: "Mr. Bones, justice is rarely clean. But it is justice nonetheless. You trusted someone who didn't deserve it, and that's not a weakness, it's proof you're still human. Don't let her steal that from you too." Park read it 3 times before looking around his small apartment, the sanctuary he'd built from wreckage, thinking about Sophia in her luxury condo now seized by federal authorities. 6 months later, Park walked into his new office building, Bones-built projects etched on glass doors that reflected a man who'd survived devastation and chosen to rebuild rather than surrender to bitterness. He'd used part of the settlement money to start his own construction firm, the rest invested wisely and placed into a modest house on Austin's outskirts with views of hill country that stretched endlessly toward horizons he'd once thought unreachable. He'd started dating Adriana, a graphic designer who made him laugh without demanding explanations for the scars he carried, life becoming something close to normal for the first time in years. Then his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "We need to talk. Lillian." They met at a coffee shop in Cinemas, Lillian younger than he'd imagined, mid-30s with Sophia's eyes but none of her polished cruelty. She wasn't apologizing, she explained, just warning him that Sophia was planning something from prison, 18 months after violating her plea deal, contacting investors and lawyers, convinced someone would bankroll her comeback. Sophia blamed Park for everything, Lillian said, and she wasn't the kind of person who let things go, her patience and calculation making her dangerous even behind bars. Park drove home slowly after their meeting, thinking about Sophia's release in 2 months, about whether prison had changed her or simply given her time to plot revenge, about the warning in Lillian's voice that sounded like genuine concern from someone who'd finally seen her half-sister clearly. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share.